Now here's an stage, and you got to see Ed in person. What was the first time you met Ed? Because I know you were in California, right, in the mid '70s when they were making pumping iron.
Yeah, they were great heady days at Gold's Gym in the early '70s, especially the mid '70s, I would say. And I happened to be out there during some of the filming of Pumping Iron. And that's when I first met Ed Corney. I had seen pictures of him, certainly when he won the IFTV Mr. America in the early '70s, and when he went to Baghdad, I believe, and won the Mr. Universe in 1972 also. But
right.
California in 1975 is when I first spoke to him. And he was a gentleman at the first meeting that I had with him. And as I related to some people, he was always one of the first to speak to me after the Olympia contest. And to his credit, he always spoke with respect, even though at none of the contests that I judged did he win.
Mm-hmm.
He was just interested in what he showed, what I thought, how he could improve, if he was better than the previous year. And he always did it dignified and as a gentleman. He was really a lot of fun guy and serious when he had to be. But what he did on that stage, nobody else, in my opinion, in the history of the sport did previously or subsequently.
Yeah. So the first time you actually met him in person was in 1975. Did you ever see him on stage before that, before 1975?
No, I had never seen him on stage. The only the first time I saw him was training at Gold's, and for subsequent days training at Gold's, which I can tell you were always intense days. If Corney had a light day, I never saw it.
Right.
The same could be said of Arnold or Draper or Zane or Serge Jacobs at the time. When they trained, they all trained hard.
Yeah. Now, we all know that Ed was training with Arnold in 1975, and that was captured in the movie Pumping Iron. So did you get to see those guys training together during that time?
You know, there was a small snippet of Pumping Iron where Arnold walks into the gym in Gold's Gym, and Ed Giuliani jumps into his arms, and
right.
The keen observer can notice right behind Arnold is this smaller guy walking in a black shirt and black sweatpants, which happened to be me. So I was there at a lot of the training sessions when Butler was filming Pumping Iron.
Yeah.
Great days.
Absolutely, yeah. One thing I remember about that was Ed was really sort of honored to be training with Arnold, and I read this old article recently in one of my old Muscle Builder magazines, and I got it out. I think it was from 1976, and Ed talked a lot about training with Arnold and how much that meant to him and how much it really changed his philosophy. And he was very insightful and very thoughtful in this article. And so it was like a real honor for Ed to be not only a part of the movie Pumping Iron, but just to go into the Mr. Olympia and compete with the best. And him and Franco went down to the wire that year in 1975, and he actually beat Frank Zane. A lot of people forget about that. But just to be a part of the whole process and train with Arnold and go through that whole experience, I think, of getting ready for a contest with the greatest bodybuilder ever.
Yes, he might have been grateful, but I can tell you when I viewed that, he was never intimidated. His intensity was just as great as Arnold's or anybody else who was training there, or even better. And I can tell you that was with the cameras or without the cameras on him.
Yeah.
He was always a gentleman, and outside of training and inside of training, he was really an animal. He really trained hard. He never held back. His intensity was great. He realized that during a set of an exercise, every rep was a warm-up for the hard ones at the end. and he never backed out of those last repetitions.
Yeah. Now, did you go to the Mr. Olympia the first time it was in Columbus in 1976 when?
I was in Columbus in 1976. As a matter of fact, I covered the contest for Ironman.
Oh, okay.
And it was the first time I saw Corney pose, and the only time that Corney was outdone was by himself the following year. But I did make a note, and I did put it in print in 1976, and I would stand by it this day that a video should have been made of his posing routine that should have been kept for posterity, that every future pro or amateur could look at that video and understand the best way or the most exciting, dynamic way to show off your physique. And I'll tell you another thing about it. I'll tell you another thing about Ed Corney. He never had to hold his hand up to his ear to encourage the audience to applaud for him when he was posing.
No, never.
Never.
That horrendous practice was not around back then.
You know, I will reflect to you, John, that the two greatest ovations I ever heard for a physique competitor were in 1965 at the Brooklyn Academy of Music for Larry Scott.
Right.
And in 1977 for Ed Corney in Columbus, Ohio. And John Balick said to me, and I think he was spot on when he said there was 2,200 people watching Scott in 65, and there was 3,500 watching Corney in 77.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah, great. So, you know, he got the greatest ovation I ever heard at a bodybuilding contest.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I was there too in 77. And now 77, if we can reflect upon that for a second, that was a pretty amazing year for bodybuilding, because that was the year that Pumping Iron came out, which was released in January. And maybe people don't remember this at the time, but it was kind of a smaller movie, more of a kind of an art house movie that was only released in certain theaters around the United States. It wasn't a big release. It wasn't like the Avengers or Black Panther or anything like that. So not many people really saw it, but I think those of us in the bodybuilding community saw it. And so later that year on October 1st, that was when the Mr. Olympia was held in Columbus, Ohio. And Franco was the winner the year before, but he had injured his leg in that World's Strongest Man contest. So Franco wasn't coming back. So the contest was really up for grabs. And Frank Zane had taken second to Franco the year before, so he was one of the favorites. But I think everybody was looking at Robbie Robinson as the guy who was going to win. And, of course, Lou Ferrigno was also supposed to go in it, and then Lou dropped out because he got the Hulk role. But when Ed Corney came out, number one, he was in great shape, probably the best shape he'd been in definitely since 1975, because I think in 76 he was a little bit off. So he came out in 77, but because, and this is my opinion, I think because that movie Pumping Iron came out that year, and Ed was featured extensively in the movie as Arnold's training partner, and then they also focused on his posing at the prejudging of the 1975 Mr. Olympia, and that's when Arnold's in the audience with Danny Padilla and Robbie, and he goes, "Wow, that's what I call posing."
I think you mean 1976 on that. When Arnold was in the audience, 75 was in Pretoria, but 76 was in Columbus. So
right.
Arnold happened to be sitting right behind me, and did turn around to Christine Zane and tell her, I believe that was the year, that how good Frank looked in 76. But Arnold did say that year also that Corney, this is the best posing routine he'd ever seen.
Oh, really? He said it.
Pedestal. He could make a complete 360 turn, but there was no revolving pedestal. It was him being able to move his feet and his body around in harmony to show his, front, side, and back. And oh my God, you couldn't believe what you're seeing. And then people would stand up and cheer for him, and it was, and then flash bulbs would go off, and it was the whole 9 yards. I mean, it was really quintessential showmanship in those golden days.
Yeah. And one thing I read an article by Ed, and one thing he said, and this is true, is that when he posed, even though he posed very smoothly and with great transitions, it was almost a masculine way he did it. It was very powerful. It wasn't, I guess, in the book Pumping Iron, they compare Frank Zane's posing to Ed Corney's posing, and they make a mention of how Ed Corney does it the best, because Frank did it, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with the way Frank did it, but it was more balletic, where Corney did it in a way where the transitions were very powerful and very masculine, and it was just an amazing thing to see.
Really, you really couldn't compare Corney's posing to anybody else's. Arnold's was very powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Arnold's posing was tremendously improved from 1970 to 1975, and I think one of the reasons it was so improved is he was so confident in the way he looked and just the way Arnold was. He supreme confidence in everything he did, and it just reflected in his posing.
Mm-hmm.
Zane was just a different type of poser. But I'll tell you a quick anecdote that I think you'll find interesting. In early 1976, in the winter, the Whitney Museum in New York, which is a famous art museum,
mm-hmm.
held what they called bodybuilding as art evening for bodybuilders. And John Balick and I, John, who used to live in Philadelphia, traveled up there and met up with Arnold and Frank Zane and Ed Corney. And Arnold had just retired. But of the three bodybuilders, the only one who was in shape that February evening in 1976 was Ed Corney. And he stole the show at the Whitney. And the funny thing was that Zane was up there, and Zane looked to me to be about 20 pounds lighter than I had seen him before, and way, way softer. And I said to John Balick, I said, there's no way that Frank Zane is going to enter the Olympia in 76. I think he must be retiring. Well, not only did he not retire, he looked absolutely fantastic.
Yeah.
In 1976, had almost won the Olympia. Franco,
right.
And was very disappointed what he did. And then I said to myself, you know what? I understand nothing about contest prep, and I definitely understand why Zane is called the chemist, because whatever he did between February and September of 76 was extraordinary. But the point being that Corney was in shape then, and quite frankly, I never really saw Corney out of shape, realizing that he was 44 in 1977. So, subsequently his decline over the years as far as placings can be understood. And then, of course, in the 90s, he came back and entered, the Masters post-60 Olympia, and I think he won several times.
Yeah.
So he could always be counted on to be in shape, that's for sure.
Yeah, let's talk about 78. I mean, you were at that show also, and I was as well. And I remember Ed, after taking third, I thought he would be one of the favorites, and unfortunately, I think he placed only seventh. But I was really impressed with the way he looked in 78. I thought physically he was even in better shape. He looked thicker to me and more cut, and he did a really unique posing routine, and I got to give him credit for this, because he was trying to do something that no one else had done, and you could see he was really, pushing the boundaries of just expanding his art of posing. And that's where he did the thing where he had one arm up over his head straight, and the other arm was straight out in front of him, and then he turned in a circle like a clock on stage. You remember that?
Yeah, I thought that he had done that in 77, as I alluded to, but I think that you're probably right. And as a matter of fact, though my memory is a little bit faded, he did come to me after that contest and ask about his placing. And it's so totally subjective. But I thought he was a bit heavy, and I told him so, and he did say, you know what, I was sharper the past year, and I don't feel that I could compete being sharper against these guys when the sport seems to be getting heavier. And
Oh,
I
wow.
said, but he was sincere. But I said to him, I would be if I was you, I would be the best that I can be and ignore the surroundings.
Yeah.
And I would have given him the same advice today. I mean, even back in the 70s, as you know, I mean, when you had such different types of physiques, you had that Richard Baldwin type of really lean, muscular, great physique.
Mm-hmm.
And then you had the really big guys who outweighed Baldwin by 20, 30 pounds. You had a completely different type of physique, but you couldn't change to redefine yourself and to remake yourself. By that time, I don't think it could be done. And Boyer Coe, I think, pointed that out. He said, "I am what I am."
Mm-hmm.
How the audience expects me to be better every single year. Is that really realistic?
Mm-hmm.
So I gave the advice to Corney, my sincere advice as a judge, and he took it, and I think he went, he agreed with it, but he certainly didn't argue with me or become defensive. And I could very easily have said to him, you better bigger, you got to be bigger. The sport's getting bigger, the guys are getting bigger, do whatever they can to get bigger. But I didn't, I had to be myself too, and I told him, be yourself. And whether those words stuck or not, I don't know, but he certainly wasn't down in 78. His body weight was up, and he was right there. He placed seventh, but you remember, that competition that year, 77 and 79, you could have placed third to seventh and with a point or so difference. I mean, he beat Boyer Coe in 77 by 1 point, and Boyer Coe was in an amazing shape.
Yeah.
So, so it's subjective, and they use the point system, and it was, they were all neck and neck. From 1 to 7, you never knew, each year, where the placings would be, which I think made the sport so great during that time.
Yeah, that's great that he came back to you and talked to you, but he wasn't mad at all. I mean,
I could tell you, he was the exception to the rule. I could tell you that.
Yeah, right.
Only one person can win. It was an honor to being a judge all those years. But you're dealing with sensitive men who train hard all year. Some of them for one contest, and then they have people who support them, who acknowledge them all year. Oh, you can't be beaten.
Yeah.
You can't be beaten. And all of a sudden they're beaten, and then all of a sudden the judges are no good.
Yeah.
But you tried the best you can, and you really try to be efficient. You try to be non-biased, and when you think that you can be as objective as possible, then you take your seat at the judges' table. I recused myself in 1980, and I was a head judge of 81, but I was a non-voting judge. But in 1980, I trained Mike Menser the months before the Olympia. I couldn't even though I was a head judge of the IFBB, I couldn't very well judge that contest, could I?
Right.
It wouldn't have been fair. But if I had, the history of bodybuilding might have been different.
Yeah, right.
Who knows? The same about 81. So I was.
Yeah, well, I could see Ed being a little upset because he did go down from 3rd to 7th, and I think Danny Padilla was 6th, and Cal Skalak was 5th, and Boyer was 4th. Roy Callender was 3rd, Robbie was 2nd again, and then Frank Zane won his 2nd title. So, but I was impressed with his performance, and that posing routine really sticks in my mind. Of course, 77 was the historic one, but I also thought it was pretty cool what he did in 78. It seemed like he was trying to try something different. He was trying to just expand on what he could do.
I totally agree, but I will say to you that although the placings are so important, I think the ovation he got in '78 was enough for him.
Mm-hmm.
Again, he got the loudest ovation of the night again.
Yeah.
And he placed seventh. And so I think when he approached me afterwards, he wasn't really as despondent as I would say Robbie Robinson was, or certainly Cal Scalick, who impersonated Jesus that night.
Right, crucified, right. And one thing I want to also mention about Ed is it had to be a great honor for him, or a great compliment to him, that George Butler and Charles Gaines used his picture on the book of Pumping Iron when he won the 1972 Mr. Universe. They didn't use Arnold, who was, probably the centerpiece of the book, but they did use the picture of Ed Corney, and I thought that was always a great thing, because they said that picture encapsulated the joy of bodybuilding, the victory, and Ed really captured it in that photo.
Yeah, I agree with you, although they could have chosen one of 100 pictures, maybe 1,000 pictures to be on the cover of that. So I'm sure, hey, he's going to be remembered for the people who were never close enough to bodybuilding to attend contests.
Right.
That's how he's going to be remembered. And of course, during the movie when he was doing those, intense squats. The cover of the book, I mean, they can never take that away from him.
I know.
That was great, and I think really well deserved. And I agree with you. He, with a smile on his face, he did encapsulate the joy of Pumping Iron, I would say. Yeah,
and then when the movie came out a couple of years later, there were a lot of posters for the movie was using the cover of the book as a poster of the movie. So he was also, I think that poster went around. I know I've seen some gyms where they have that poster hanging in there.
I was fortunate enough to be at the premiere of Pumping Iron in New York City.
Wow. And,
okay. And remember that when we were there, it was great because there's a tremendous amount of bodybuilders there. And believe it or not, most of us came there in tuxedos.
Yeah.
You wanted to feel like you were an important part of that sport's history, and that bodybuilding was much more than the stereotype of the guy with nothing above his forehead, with these big muscles and the small head,
Yeah.
So, and that was kind of close to the epitome that night at that premiere of Pumping Iron with Butler and Gaines. It was unforgettable.
Yeah. Yeah, what a great achievement that was, sort of getting off subject a minute, but the book Pumping Iron and also the movie Pumping Iron, I mean, that really did make the sport more popular, but it was just so well done. I just got a chance to read that book again this week after Ed passed away, and I was reading the sections about him and Mike Cass when they traveled to Baghdad for that 1972 Mr. Universe. But man, it was so well written. Being a writer myself, I really admired Charles Gaines' writing in that book, and then of course George Butler's photos. And they just came together and they created this great book that I think will stand the test of time, and it really helped bring a lot of dignity and respect to bodybuilding. And I kind of look at that book as I wish that's the way the sport, that's the ideal of the sport. That's how it could be. That's the ideal of what bodybuilding could be.
For the umpteenth time, I'm going to agree exactly for what you're saying, but I think that horse has left the barn, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, I do. But it's nice to look back at that.
I don't know if we'll ever get back to what we saw. We're just fortunate enough to be there. Yeah. And because you do these podcasts, at least it takes people back to a time where common sense in bodybuilding was almost common.
Well, that's why I do them, because I like talking about those days because it was so special to me and to a lot of other people.
I agree.
When Ed continued to compete, he did the Olympia in '79. He was in there in 1980 and '81 when Arnold and Franco won. And you could tell he really loved the sport because he kept doing it even as he got older. I remember he did a great routine in '83 when it was in Munich, Germany, when Sumir won. And of course, he was past his peak then, but he was still in great shape. And I don't know how old he would have been in '83. I'm sure in his 50s, but he was still in amazing shape. And we don't think about bodybuilders being old back then, but he was much older than almost everybody except probably Albert Beckles. And he was just in great shape, and he's just doing it for the love of the sport. And his posing routine that night in Munich was really great. I think he posed, that's when he posed in My Way, wasn't it, from Frank Sinatra?
1980, I retired in 1982.
Okay.
When my wife came back from Israel, my soon-to-be wife came back from Israel, and I wrote a letter to Ben Weeder to retire from judging. So I missed 83.
Okay.
But from what I heard, Amir deserved to win that. If I have one major regret in my decisions over the years, he deserved to win in 82, I think, also, which he placed fourth. But that's besides the point. Corney was, to his credit, kept on competing, and he did it for the love of the sport. He wasn't competitive anymore, but he stayed sharp. And I think that it did well for him because he continued to stay in shape into the 60s. And again, when they had the short-lived Masters over 60, he won. So more power to him,
Yeah, he just seemed like a guy who he really loved bodybuilding, and he really understood, he really had a love for the training of the sport, and he just did it for himself, And he just did it because he really had a passion for it. And then he would just use the competitions as an extension of that. But it wasn't like he had to win. I think he just did it because he really loved it.
Yeah, but it also showed that I think most of the year he was able to stay in shape. He never seemed to be the type of guy who really got out of shape during the off season, ate too much, and had to train back into being in shape. He was always only a few pounds over contest prep most of the year, if I remember correctly. So he always knew how to stay lean and stay sharp, and it always made it so he could extend his career. I think that was smart thinking.
And then Ed was always a staple at the Arnold Classic. I don't know about the Olympia, but the Arnold Classic, I remember always seeing him there every year, over the last 10 years. He was always at, I think, the Europa booth. And he was there with his big training partner, a guy who was, I don't know what the guy's name is, but he was a big Samoan-like guy. And Ed was always there signing pictures and was very, very attentive and very nice to everybody who came up to him. And I remember he really loved the ladies. I remember one year I brought my girlfriend at the time up there, and he spent more time looking at her and talking to her. He was almost like he was trying to take her away from me, than he was talking to me. So I heard stories about him doing that with other women too. He really loved the ladies, so he always gave them a lot of attention. But he was always a great guy,
He must have been a major inspiration to you because every year you managed to try to emulate him in a way to peak one time a year and to see what kind of shape you can get in as the years progress.
Yeah.
And the pictures that you put out there, you managed to do that quite well.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think it's good if you're a bodybuilder to, sort of stay in touch with the sport in a way, and just try to peak every year and never lose sight of that. And like you said, Ed was like that too, because he was always in good shape, and he never had to go far to get ready for a contest.
That seemed to be the way he was. That's the way I saw it anyway. Every time I saw it, he was never far out from being in shape.
Yeah. Well, he must have meant a lot to a lot of the people in the bodybuilding world, Roger, because this week when he passed away on Facebook, there were just so many people who really spent the time to write something about him and to say, it's so sad that we lost this guy. And even though he was now 85 and, he was at his peak, in the 1970s, that's a long way away. So he was obviously someone who was still well remembered, and that made me feel good to see that so many people in bodybuilding. Well, I know Lee Haney put something up, and Rachel McLish put something up, and I think Tom Platz put something up. I guess Tom and his wife were very close to him. So it was just great to see all these former champions say something about Ed Corney. That just showed you what an impact he had on the sport, and that hopefully he will not be forgotten.
I agree, and it also shows the camaraderie that there was during this so-called golden age. And, of course, it was also the infancy of the women's bodybuilding movement. So I wasn't surprised when Rachel McLish fondly remembered him, or Tanya Knight, or Mary Jarumbo, or any of those early great female bodybuilders who remember their time in the sport, and their recollections are pretty much spot on with ours. You know, it was a great time, and he was a central figure through the whole thing.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, he really led the way with the posing, and that was just such a special impact he made on the sport. And I think it's great that Arnold's going to do this at the Arnold Classic now, because, like I said, at least his name will always be alive, and we won't forget about him. And, you know, it's not like he died a young man. He lived a full life. He died, you know, at 85 years old. Of course, we all want to live forever, but, you know, he lived a full life, and it's just, we don't want to see a guy like that go, because he was such a great guy. And he's so full of life. When I saw him at the Arnold Classic every year, he was always, even though he was getting older, he just had that sparkle in his eye. He was so full of life. So, but he will always be remembered, definitely by me and those of us who love the sport, because he did have such a special impact, not only with his physique, but with the posing and just his attitude and the way he presented himself.
Yeah, I would say on reflection, we can say definitively that he was always ahead of the curve.
Yeah,
he was always trying something new to improve on what he was and what he could be. So it's with total respect that I have this conversation with you in remembering him. Just a great champion at a great time, a great personality, and a guy who I would say without reservations realized his full physical potential.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we'll always remember him, and it's sad to see our heroes dying from the golden age, but it's going to happen to every one of us. So at least he'll always be remembered, and, you know, I hope we're able to shed some light on how great he was on the show with this interview to those of the people out there, the listeners out there who weren't around to see him, you know, at his peak.
Well, I'm happy to be with you today, and I'm glad that we did this. And I think we made our points very well, and I think people respect the sincerity that we showed to a great man, a great champion.
Right, absolutely. All right, Roger. Well, thanks again for joining us on the Bodybuilding Legends podcast. I hope to have you on again soon in the near future, because it's always a pleasure to talk to you, and you were around for so many great moments of the sport. And again, Happy New Year to you and your family. And hopefully we'll talk to you again soon, Roger.
Yes, my respect to you always. Take care.
All right. Thanks, Roger. Take care.
Bye-bye.